Right, well, we've had quite a few presentations today, some of which, like Charles Goodhart's mentioned, Milton Friedman's enormous impact upon the academy and upon economic thinking. We've also heard about how there was indeed a radical change in macroeconomic policy and management in the sort of late 1970s, early 1980s, but the historians have been telling us that Milton Friedman had little, if anything, to do with that. There's no evidence of his being the progenitor or cause of that shift, which does raise all kinds of interesting questions about why, in fact, therefore, there's such a perception that he did have such an impact. Now, what I'm going to argue is that he did have a political as well as an intellectual influence. Secondly, that this influence was crucially facilitated, maybe even made possible, by intermediaries, specifically the Institute of Economic Affairs, but also others. And thirdly, and crucially, that the influence that he had was not of the kind that is commonly supposed or understood. And this is partly because think tanks such as the IEA, I'm afraid to say, for reasons of their own, tend to present the kind of influence that people like Friedman have through them as being other than what it actually is. We've got here a quote from an article in the Historical Journal about Friedman's influence and about the role played in this by the IEA. And as you'll see, the claim made in that paper is that the IEA's part in Friedman's bringing ideas into the British mainstream was crucial. And my sort of presentation is a riff on that in a way. So there's three things I want to sort of like quickly go over in my talk. The first is the role of think tanks in economic and political change, change in thinking, change in policy, change in the intellectual world. How important is it? And what exactly is the form that it takes? Because I think this is where a lot of the misunderstandings arise. And also, if we grant that think tanks like the IEA did play a major part in changing the political discourse in the late 70s and early 80s, is that replicable? Or was there something peculiar and particular about the circumstances of that time that made it possible, which is hard to replicate? Secondly, as it says here, intellectual genealogy. I'm going to briefly say something about the genealogy of thinking about money, monetary policy, the role of money in the economy, and the way in which what happened towards the end of the 1960s and thereafter was a blending or merging of what had originally been two slightly different intellectual traditions of thinking about money, one broadly British, the other broadly American. And thirdly, related to what Peter Jay said in his remarks earlier on, try and answer the question of what was actually being argued about in Britain in that period between roughly the early 1970s through to about 1982-83. And how does that help us to understand what the influence and impact of Friedman actually was? So the IEA's inheritance is not how it's commonly supposed now. I wrote a paper about this a few years ago, which has not actually yet been published, although I think it was supposed to be published, but vanished down the black hole, I'm afraid to say. I gave it to the Southern Economic Association a few years ago. One thing that you realise if you look at the early papers of the IEA and the early publications it brought out is that right from the start its main target was Keynes rather than, say, Marx. The main animus was against Keynesian monetary policy, Keynesian macroeconomics, rather than outright socialism. And what this reflected was the intellectual roots or origins of people like Harris and Selden, particularly Arthur Selden, which came from the interwar debates on monetary policy. And the real influences were the people who, if you like, after 1945 had lost out to not so much Keynes himself as his followers, particularly Nicholas Cowdell. In other words, people like Sir Dennis Robertson, Ralph Hawtrey, later on Harry Johnson, who got mentioned earlier on. He was a kind of survivor of that tradition. So it's really the LSE stroke Cambridge tradition of British monetary thinking and their hostility to Keynes that is the underlying intellectual inheritance of the IEA and drives a lot of its early intellectual agenda. One aspect of this, by the way, which is often forgotten, although Arthur Selden mentions it many times in his writings, was the influence of what you might call social democratic anti-Keynesianism, particularly the very sceptical view of Keynes and Keynesianism taken by people like Hugh Dalton, but above all Evan Durbin, who, before his very untimely death, was one of the rising stars in the Labour Party, and who Arthur Selden always thought would have completely transformed the Labour Party had he survived and become Hugh Gaitskell's number 2, as he probably would have done. And the key transmitters of these ideas, apart from Arthur himself, were also W.H. Hutt, who, although he was based in South Africa for most of his time, was also a very active participant in debates, regular visitor to the IEA, and as I mentioned, Harry Johnston. Now, meanwhile, across in the Atlantic, there was, I think, a rather different anti-Keynesian tradition, and this was obviously the one that came from the Chicago School, as it later became known. The two initial figures are Henry Simon and Frank Knight, of course, being Milton Friedman's supervisor, but in fact, the later course of development didn't owe that much to them, partly because of Knight's rather awkward personality, I think it's fair to say. And so the key figures are Friedman himself, but also his father-in-law, heir and director, a number of other people, George Stigler perhaps. But the focus here is on an attack upon Keynesian macroeconomic thinking, but coming from a slightly different starting point to the one that you found in the UK. So what you have during the 1950s, intellectually speaking, is two different intellectual traditions, or genealogies if you will, which are broadly separate. There's not that much overlap between the two. And in the British case, as we heard earlier, the tradition of people like Robertson and Hawtrey gradually peters out in the British Academy, and it's only kept going by the IEA, basically, which is publishing, still publishing Harry Johnston, people like him, trying to lay into the idols of Paynetism, basically. Now, originally, as I say, there was not much contact between the IEA, Ralph Harrison, Arthur Selden, and Milton Friedman, but they came into contact when the IEA, in the shape of Anthony Fisher, organised a Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 1960. Now, this was at a time where the Society was undergoing enormous internal ructions, centred around partly the rather bizarre personality of Albert Hunold, who had been the secretary of the president of the Society, but also due to, as I think Angus Bergin pretty persuasively argues, a division between what you might call the continental European members of the Society, notably Friedrich Hayek, and its American members, most notably Milton Friedman. But one of the sort of side effects of this rather fraught sort of series of events, the meeting first of all here in the UK and then subsequently in 1961 in Turin, is that Harris and Selden made very strong contact with Friedman, and from that point onwards he starts to become a much more strong influence upon the IEA and its work, although this doesn't really become apparent until the end of the decade, following his presidential paper, of course. And what then happens is that he's given the invitation to deliver the first Wincott lecture, and this of course takes the form of the IEA publication, The Counter-Revolution in Monetary Theory, and that is the point at which, if you like, the IEA introduces Selden's views about the Phillips curve and about the effect of monetary policy and its lack of, its alternative to the orthodox Keynesian demand management model into what you might call, well, into what? Well, what happens is that, as you'll see, the IEA basically introduces these ideas through a whole series of informal channels, which Peter J. mentioned, Hobart lunches and the like. They're introduced into British political and media circles. And what the IEA does, what Harris and Selden do, is to quite deliberately try to spread these ideas into British public discourse. And I'll explain in a moment exactly what form this propagation of these ideas took, because it took a very particular and distinctive form. It wasn't so much an academic input, although that was going on at the same time, nor was it so much a conscious and deliberate proposals of specific policy. Rather, it was the introduction of a particular way of thinking about what was at that time the increasingly acute conundrum in British politics. And so there are a number of different channels. One of them is certain politicians. A key figure is Enoch Powell. In his case, it's not done through the IEA. He had actually become aware of Friedman's arguments earlier, being one of those sort of rare birds who's both a politician and a genuine intellectual. And in the collection of speeches that is published called Free to Choose, which is a series of speeches he made in the 1960s, you can see that he's already taken up Friedman's monetary analysis of the nature and causes of inflation. It's worth saying, though, by the way, that Powell's main focus at that point, before 1970, was budgetary and fiscal policy, which goes back to, of course, his resignation along with Peter Thornycroft and Nigel Birch from the Treasury under Macmillan, the famous little local difficulty. But there are others as well. John Biffen, Jock Bruce Garvine, Nicholas Ridley, who was mentioned earlier. There's a number of Conservative MPs, not necessarily the ones who later on became prominent, such as Margaret Thatcher, Nigel Lawson, Geoffrey Howe, although Keith Joseph does undergo a kind of road to Damascus experience in the mid-1970s. It's rather people who at this time were backbenchers, but who later on went on to hold, in many cases, ministerial office in the Thatcher government. But what this did was to insert Friedman's analysis of inflation and how to deal with it as a policy position into the internal politics of the Conservative Party, and into an argument that was going on within the Conservative Party at the time over how they should respond to what seemed at the time to be the increasingly dominant position of the Labour Party in British politics. The other thing was through people in the media, and there were a number of key journalists who were identified by the IEA as being crucial figures in transmitting these arguments into the press. You can see the names there. Peter Jay, despite his denials, was actually one of them. He admitted to me after the session earlier that he wrote a paper for the IEA, which I remember very clearly. But some of the other people, key figures are there. Samuel Britton at the Financial Times, Andrew Alexander at the Daily Mail, Patrick Cuthbert, forgotten figure now, who wrote a wonderful book about how the middle class was being oppressed and needed to fight back. Also other people such as Peter Utley, although his interests were more in other areas, but he did spread these ideas as well as other people who are almost forgotten now, like Walter Salomon, who was another sort of like figure in the whole media of spreading these ideas around, and Harry Johnson and others were still putting the ideas around as well. So what happened was that a particular kind of take on the conundrum facing British politics at the time, which drew upon Friedman's arguments and analysis and expressed them in rather straightforward and simplified ways, became a part of the public discourse. And this was made possible by the Institute of Economic Affairs. Had that think tank not been there, had it not acted as a conduit to take what were basically academic ideas and put them into both that political media and the world of the press, it would have been much more difficult for Friedman to do this. Philip Booth said to me in an earlier coffee break that in some ways think tanks are transactions cost producers. Had Milton Friedman tried to spread his ideas directly by going to talk to individual politicians, the transactions costs have been really, really high. But what think tanks do is to reduce those costs and to get the ideas out more generally. They're basically fulfilling the role that the periodical press used to play in the Victorian period, I would say. Now, why was he important? Well, as I say, he brought something that had been lacking. One of them was, and this was one of his great gifts, a way of expressing a position on contemporary, very hard to argue about issues that was very easy to understand and could be expressed in everyday language. You could simply say, what is the position? Well, inflation is a monetary phenomenon, it's got nothing to do with wage pressure, it's got nothing to do with cost push, it's entirely to do with the quantity of money. That's something that you can put across in very, very simple terms. Politicians, like Nicholas Ridley, as we heard, can use that kind of argument on the stump in everyday speech. Friedman was not alone in having this gift. I think Paul Samuelson was another great exponent of popularising economics at the time, from a very different viewpoint, of course. But it's a rather unusual gift. There's also, when you think about it, clear and obvious policy implications. However, what I don't want to argue, because as we heard this morning, I think the evidence doesn't support it, is that the policies actually adopted followed from the intellectual argument. I think the actual position is slightly different, and I'll say in a moment what it is. Finally, there's Friedman's personal policies. He was an unusually gifted person in terms of being able to communicate on 3 different registers. He was widely respected by his academic peers. He was a brilliant teacher who had a huge impact upon his graduate students, and he also had an enormous gift in popularisation and speaking to the lay public. It's very unusual to have intellectuals who have all of those 3 qualities. Normally people can only communicate in about 2 of those registers if you're lucky. Now, what actually happened? Well, before I go to talk about what's on this slide, the common sort of notion that you have about the role of think tanks and the impact of intellectuals like Friedman is that intellectuals come up with ideas. These ideas then, a bit like a virus, a meme, lodge themselves in the brains of politicians, and they then shape and drive the policy responses and choices made by those politicians. That's the point of the famous Keynes quote. I don't think that's actually true. I think what you actually find when you look at the records is that politicians pick up ideas and arguments to justify and explain policies that they've already decided they want to do anyway, or that they've been driven to do by the force of circumstance. So in other words, what is important is to be around with a set of arguments and a set of explanations that the politicians, if you like, find both convenient and useful at a particular point of crisis. Now, does that mean that these ideas, these arguments, Friedman or others, are like just pure window dressing, that the politicians are simply mouthing them while getting on with something they wanted to do anyway? In some cases, yes, but there's also 2 ways in which they do actually have a profound effect. The first of them is what you might call discourse effects. Basically, the vocabulary and arguments that politicians use shape and limit the kind of policies that they can advocate. This is a kind of Jack Pocock point, if you will. It's very hard to use Friedman-style arguments to advocate for something like the Labour Party's alternative economic strategy, to take an extreme case. When you have a particular vocabulary or set of arguments at your disposal as the means for explaining what you want to do, what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it, that actually limits the range of policies that you can plausibly and effectively advocate. So in some sense, words and the vocabulary you have actually tends to shape what you do in a rather strange way. The other thing is that even though ideas may be taken up by politicians initially for instrumental reasons, ultimately over time they internalise those arguments, they actually come to believe in them. And then what you also get is a generational effect in which the original generation of politicians are replaced by younger ones who actually do believe the arguments that were formerly used in a straightforwardly instrumental fashion. And so in that sense, the ideas actually do ultimately influence policy. It's just that the initial breakthrough, as I say, has a more instrumental quality. We're talking about monetary policy, but you could equally make a point about, say, privatisation, where the original motive for privatising British Telecom was that the British Treasury knew they had to spend a huge amount of money on updating the telephone system, but didn't want to do it because it would lower the public sector borrowing requirement completely to pieces. So they sort of thought, well, wait a minute, didn't the IEA publish a paper a few years ago, it was Sidney Kane actually, advocating the sale of telephones? Why not try that? And then they thought, wow, that worked quite well. Let's see what else we can do with it. And then later on, by the time we get to the Major government, it becomes an actually sincerely held political principle. So, coming to this one, is this replicable? Maybe this was all a conjoncture exceptionnelle. That's a French term from French historiography. It comes from Fernand Braudel. If you prefer the English, then you can call it a completely random and fortuitous concatenation of circumstances, to quote P.G. Woodhouse. Either way, it may be that there was something peculiar about what was going on between roughly the mid-1970s and the early 1980s, which you can't replicate. It may be also that since then there's been a change in the academy, which means that academics generally, regardless of their ideology, find it more difficult to communicate with the lay public. They're too busy writing articles for referee journals, which are going to be read by, I am told, on average 9 people. Which of course by maths means that there's a significant number which are read by 0 people, and to actually communicate with the public. It may also be that the media has changed in ways that make communication much more difficult. Where are the modern counterparts perhaps of people like Sam Britton or Andrew Alexander, you might say that Michael Wolff is the counterpart today, but does he quite have the influence that his earlier forebears did? On the other hand, you could also argue in some ways it's become easier for politicians to find ideas. Either they can just read the stuff themselves, or more likely, they get their staffers to read it, and the staffers then write up a 200-word summary for them to use, although that does lead to a Chinese whispers kind of process, which leads to people suddenly thinking, wait a minute, that's not what I just said. On the other hand, it may well be still much the same, because what we can see today is that certain ideas and arguments are indeed being picked up and used by politicians, only these days, I'm afraid to say, they seem to be mostly bad ideas, as the case of Donald Trump, amongst other people, should show us. Maybe what's missing, perhaps, is the personal thing. Maybe you just need people with the peculiar combination of personal qualities that Friedman had to bring this kind of major change about. And what was the argument? Well, this really is a reiteration of what Peter Jay said. The real argument at the time in Britain, between roughly the very late 1960s or early 1970s and about 1982-83, was over three big issues: inflation and the apparently remorseless acceleration of inflation, the whole problem of labour relations and the quite catastrophic state of British labour relations at the time, the problem of unemployment, which, as Peter mentioned, was rising again steadily along with it. And this was captured in Peter Jay's own formulation of what was called the trilemma, which was the impossibility of combining at the same time free collective bargaining, full employment and stable prices. And the argument was one of them basically had to go. You could only choose two of the three. And these were linked to other big policy issues, the balance of payments and the exchange rate. It's worth saying, by the way, that one of the other arguments Friedman gave was not just the monetary explanation of inflation, it was the argument that floating exchange rates were nothing to worry about, perfectly okay, and in fact the way you wanted to go, which was an enormous relief to British politicians who previously had had nightmares about the problem of trying to cope with the fixed exchange rate under the Bretton Woods regime. And what Friedman's arguments did was to cut this Gordian knot. It meant that instead of having to engage in very complicated arguments about how to trade off labour controls, wage and price controls against the need for stable prices and full employment, while all the while the balance of payments are deteriorating, you could simply say, well, inflation is just a matter of money. We're printing too much money, we need to stop making so much money, we need to control the growth in the money supply, and we can stabilise things. That was a much simpler argument. It cut through, as I say, this Gordian knot. And so that basically is what I would argue, that what Friedman did was to provide a set of arguments, a body of rhetoric, if you will, which made possible and was used by politicians to justify a huge change in major policy. Could that policy have been done as successfully without those arguments? I actually doubt it. I think that words matter more in politics than we often imagine. And could that have been done without think tanks like the IEA? I also would argue not, because it provided a crucial function, which was to reduce the cost, if you will, and increase the ease of getting those ideas into crucial places from which they spread throughout the public world.